Welcome, class. It's Dr. Lindner. In today's class, we are going to be talking about different types of tissues. When we talk about tissues, I think I may have mentioned this in a previous um, lecture, that there's four types of tissues. There's epithelial tissue, there's connective tissue, there's muscle tissue, and there's nerve tissue. Now, how do we get these four different types of tissues? If you think back to an earlier video, an earlier class, we said that chemistry or chemicals come together to make cells, and then cells come together to make tissues, and then tissues come together to make organs, then organs come together to make systems, and systems come together to make the organism. So when we have a group of cells that have similar structure and function, and cells come together with different types of unions or junctions, like different cell junctions, like desmosomes or hemidesmosomes or tight junctions or gap junctions. So when they come together, they make epithelial, connective tissue, nerve tissue, and muscle tissue. And I'm going to break these up into epithelium, which has several subcategories to it. Then we'll pause. I'll create another video just on connective tissue. Then we'll pause, and I'll make one on nerve and muscle because it's much, much shorter. So let's take a look at the first type of tissue, which is epithelial tissue. Now, under a microscope, when we look at epithelial, we're going to see a bunch of cells that are closely packed together like this, right? We see these four cube-shaped cells, and they're very close together, and they're only one cell layer thick here, but I can put another group of cells just next to it, also cube-shaped, but maybe I'll make them two layers, but nonetheless, they're packed closely together. That's a distinct and unique characteristic of epithelial tissue. It's a bunch of cells packed closely together with very, very little extracellular matrix, ECM, extracellular matrix. The term extra means outside of the cell. When you hear the word intra, it usually means inside the cell. So little extracellular matrix. Now, that's different than what I'll talk about in another video, which is connective tissue, which is where we may have a cell here, maybe a protein filament, then we'll have another cell here, maybe we'll have another cell with an interesting looking nucleus like this, right? So what we'll see in this type of slide is that the cells are not packed closely together, but there's lots of extracellular matrix or space between cells, okay? So epithelium, bunch of cells packed closely together with little extracellular matrix, whereas in connective tissue, we have lots of ECM, lots of extracellular matrix. Now, focusing on epithelium now, epithelium is known as a lining or a covering type of tissue. So it's going to cover the external surface of the body. Now, when you think of, all right, what do we have that covers the external surface of the body? You're going to think skin. And we'll talk about skin in one of these videos today. And skin has different layers. It has an epidermis, it has a dermis, and has a hypodermis. Epi means above, hypo means below. So the epidermis is the part of the skin that you actually see with your naked eye. But the epidermis also has 5 microscopic layers that we'll talk about. So the epidermis of the skin is epithelium. Also, it can line body cavities. Well, we spoke about body cavities, didn't we? Didn't we speak about the pericardium and the pleura, right? We spoke about the pleura, we spoke about the peritoneum, and we spoke about the pericardium. So lining the cavities will have epithelium and also lining tubules. So now the next question you may have is, well, what are tubules? I mean, you've never really heard of this before, but in the word tubules is tube. So anything that looks like a tube is a tubule. And these tubules could be blood vessels, could be the esophagus, that's a tube. It could be the digestive tract, it's a tube. Could be the respiratory, parts of the respiratory tract has tubes, right? Whether it's like that, whether it's like that, right? These are tubes or tubules. You're going to hear tubules a whole lot when we talk about the kidney, especially the functional unit of the kidney called the nephron, that's made up of specific regions called tubules. You'll hear of the proximal convoluted tubule or a distal convoluted tubule. So the kidneys and the functional unit of the kidney called the nephron is made up of a bunch of tubules. So it's safe to assume that in those tubules of the kidneys, we're going to find epithelium. We're also going to find epithelium where we have glands, the mammary glands, the sweat glands, the oil glands, mammary glands, earwax glands, okay? Now, when we talk about epithelium, we're going to have to give epithelium its name, and we look at epithelium like here and here, we have to analyze it under a microscope, and we have to look at a few things to give it a name, okay? So the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, do we have cells that are close together? Do we have cells that are close together with little extracellular matrix? So in all of these pictures, we have a bunch of cells closely packed together with very little extracellular matrix. So that's the first question we have to ask ourselves. The second question we ask ourselves to name epithelium is, okay, do we see one layer thick of these cells, or do we see B, more than one cell layer? So if we look here, we could see this is one cell layer, but if we look over here, we see multiple. Over here, we see one cell layer. Over here, we see two. Over here, we see one cell layer, but over here, we see two. So when we see one cell layer, we're going to call it simple epithelium. And when we see more than one cell layer, we're going to refer to it as stratified epithelium. So if we see one cell layer like this, that's simple. But if we see more than one, then it's going to be stratified. Now that's true whether we have these cube shapes, whether we have shapes that look like these tall columns, or whether we have these very irregular shaped types of cells. So when we see these square ones, we call them cuboidal. When we see these tall buildings, we call them columnar, like columns. And when we see these flat, irregular shaped cells, they're called squamous cells. Now, sometimes on these cells, we will have long, slender extensions that come off of the cell membrane. and they are referred to as cilia, and cilia help to move secretions and fluids across the cell's surface. So maybe over here, we may have cilia, and the cilia beat rhythmically. They're going to move. Maybe they're going to move in this direction, or maybe they sweep in this direction. And what we'll find sometimes wedged between these cells, we can have another type of cell like this that's called a goblet cell. And these goblet cells secrete mucus that move to the top of the cilia, and they form this sticky substance up here. All right, so goblet cells can produce mucus that sticks to the cilia, and it's things can adhere to it or stick to it. All right, keep that in mind. Microvilli, these are smaller. They're much, much smaller than cilia. They're much, much smaller projections off the cell membrane, and they're used to increase absorption. So if we had a cell like this, and these were in your intestines, and you've just digested a meal, we're going to have these very, 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 very small microvilli here that act as a sponge so that the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats can come on in, get absorbed by these microvilli for absorption, to bring it in and pull it in like a sponge to eventually make it into the deeper layer where we have our blood vessels. So these nutrients come all the way in and make it into the blood vessels to carry those nutrients to different parts of the body. Okay, now let's say this is the trachea. Okay, this is your windpipe. And along the windpipe, we're going to have these columnar cells. Okay, we're going to have these long, slender columnar cells here. And there's going to be these cilia that come off of it. Now remember, we're breathing oxygen in, right? So O2, or oxygen, is coming in through the trachea. Eventually it's going to get into our lungs. So oxygen and air is coming in, and we're going to have cells here. Let me just change the color for a second. Maybe we'll make it green. Green for goblet, for G. So we're going to have these goblet cells here, these green goblet cells. They're not really green, but just to help remember it. It's going to produce mucus, and this mucus that the goblet cells produce are going to move to the apical surface, the apical surface of the cell, where we have these cilia. And now, when we breathe in air that has dust and foreign particles, it can stick, right? All the dust and all the foreign debris and particles stick to the mucus rather than making it into the deeper part of your lungs. So it has some really, really important function here. When it sticks, all you have to do is this, right? You go, you just clear your throat and it pushes it out. Now, what happens if a person smokes? If a person smokes, what ends up happening is, where we have these are columnar cells, right? Because they look like columns. And we have these cilia. The smoke kills and paralyzes the cilia. So what ends up happening is, now this is gone. This is gone. This is gone. No more cilia. So what ends up happening now is, all of the stuff, all the tar, all the chemicals from smoking, all the nicotine, all the carcinogens, everything paralyzes and destroys the cilia and all the top toxins get in to the deeper part of the lungs. And now a person is lying, they're lying asleep for hours, and the person gets up and all that tar and gunky stuff starts to accumulate. This is when the person has the smoker's cough in the morning. Right? They're coughing really all this gunk. They have to force all this stuff out because when they paralyze and damage these columnar cells, they die and the body goes through a metamorphosis. It goes through a metamorphosis called metaplasia. Metaplasia is when one cell dies and it's replaced by another. It's going to be replaced by these flat, irregular cells called squamous cells. And maybe you've heard of squamous cell carcinoma, which is throat cancer. Whenever one cell dies and it's replaced by another, it's called metaplasia. Women may be somewhat familiar with this because when women go to the gynecologist and they do a pap smear, they'll say, oh, cervical dysplasia, where the cells of the tip of the cervix are changing in shape. That happens first, and then metaplasia, and metaplasia is typically precancerous. Okay, so we're taking some information here and we're trying to make it relevant. We're trying to make it relevant to the field of healthcare for you. Because many of you may be saying, oh my God, why do we have to know this? Why do we have to remember epithelium? And how come we have to know squamous cells or squamous cells or cuboidal cells or columnar cells? Well, different parts of the body have different type and different shaped cells. So histologists are going to analyze if you're having a problem in the lungs or a problem in the uterus or a problem in the skin and the epidermis. They slough off the cells, send it to a pathologist that's a histologist. Histology is the study of tissues. They're going to look at the shape of the cells and see if they're normal or abnormal. That's how they diagnose cancers. So when we see one cell layer thick, it's simple. When we see that they're flat cells, it's simple squamous epithelium. When we see flat, irregular cells, but multiple layer, then we call it stratified squamous epithelium. When we see one layer of cube-shaped, cuboidal, it's simple cuboidal epithelium. But when we see more than one layer, then it's stratified cuboidal epithelium. When we see the tall columns, those are columnar. When it's one cell layer thick, it's simple columnar. But because these have cilia, these are simple ciliated columnar epithelium. These, because it's two layers of columnar, stratified columnar epithelium. Now look at the one to the far right. Notice it says they're columnar epithelium, but it says pseudo-stratified. Now pseudo means false. So what's giving this the appearance that it is stratified, but it's falsely stratified, because it's still one cell layer thick, so it should be simple. But if you look here, notice how all the nuclei are aligned. Here, the nuclei are aligned, the nuclei are aligned. Here, the nuclei are at different layers. Because the nuclei are at different layers, it gives it a stratified appearance. But it's pseudo-stratified columnar. The place that we find lots of pseudo-stratified columnar is in the respiratory tract. We'll see this in the respiratory tract. Okay. So again, looking at the same thing, flat, irregular cells, simple squamous epithelium, simple squamous epithelium, okay? When we are looking at the second one here it's one cell layer thick, so it's simple, and they're cube-shaped, simple cuboidal. Nuclei are pretty much all at one level, simple columnar. We name it by what we see at the apical area. So right here at the apex at the top, we have squamous cells, but it's stratified. Here, stratified cuboidal. And here, notice they're columnar shaped, but the nuclei are at multiple levels, so it's pseudo. stratified. Now, the only one I didn't mention yet is transitional. Transitional, think of what happens if we have a balloon, right? If this is a balloon and we put a square with a marker on it, but then you blow air into it, what happens to the square? It starts to change shape, right? It can actually, when you blow it up, it could look round. It changes shape as this inflates. So in certain parts of the body, like in the urinary tract, where you have a urinary bladder, which is like a balloon that can increase in size or decrease in size, whether it's distended or not, the cells can alter in shape. So those are called transitional epithelium. So let's take a look at some of the functions of the different types of epithelium. I've seen this show up on some of the Connect quizzes. So what type of epithelium can function for diffusion and filtration? Now, if I have something thick like this compared to something very irregular shaped like this, wouldn't you agree that it's a lot easier for things to pass through something that's very thin than something that's thicker? So simple squamous is really good for oxygen and CO2 to pass through this. So especially in the lungs where we have the alveolar sacs and the alveoli, we can have the exchange of gases or diffusion through simple squamous. Now, simple cuboidal, a little bit thicker, is good for protection, absorption, and secretion. Simple cuboidal is found in the nephron, and the nephron is part of the kidney, and the part of the kidney, it's called the distal convoluted tubule and the proximal convoluted tubule. Distal convoluted tubule and proximal convoluted tubule. Remember where epithelium can be found in tubules. And we said the nephron is loaded with tubules. Now, stratified squamous, this is found in areas that are involved in protection of underlying layers. When I think of stratified squamous, I'm going to think of the skin and I'm going to think of the epidermis, the top layer of the skin. Okay, the very, very top layer. When I think of pseudo stratified squamous, remember when you had cells where you had a nucleus here and maybe a nucleus was here and a nucleus here, still one cell layer, and then it has the cilia up here, and the cilia are very important for the movement of mucus because of those goblet cells. Those goblet cells produce mucus and they stick to the cilia. It's found at the apical surface. Whereas our transitional epithelium, that's going to accommodate distension and relaxation of, let's say, the urinary bladder. It changes in the organ volume. So that's going to be found throughout different parts of the kidney. So remember, we have simple epithelium or stratified epithelium. Simple, one cell layer thick. Stratified is two or more layers. Squamous is these flat, irregular shaped cells. Cuboidal, those are your cube shaped. Those are found in the tubules of the kidneys. Remember, we said it's going to be found at the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule. And then we have the columnar. Those are found also in the digestive tract and in the respiratory tract. Especially the pseudo stratified, that's going to be primarily respiratory tract. Remember, the pseudo is false. The nuclei lie at these different levels. It gives this false appearance of being stratified, and they're often associated with the cilia at the top. Our transitional epithelium, these are found in a urinary system. I think of the urinary bladder, they could be distended or relaxed, but also the ureters and the urethra. That's transitional. So again, pseudo stratified. If we look, we see the nuclei at different levels. These are columnar, and we see cilia at the top. So it's pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelium, respiratory tract. When I look at the top here, I see the apical cells. These are flat, irregular cells, so I know they're squamous, and they're multiple layers, so stratified squamous epithelium. These could be found in the upper part of the skin. They could be found in the esophagus because you're swallowing food. The food is going through this tube, right? You have food going through here and it can irritate this, so it needs protection. Stratified squamous is for protection. Simple columnar epithelium, these are found in the intestine. And you'll often have microvilli here for absorption of nutrients. Simple cuboidal, well, these are one cell layer thick. Here's the lumen. This is where everything's going to travel through. So it's only one cell. They're cube shaped, simple cuboidal. Kidneys. Remember, we have the proximal convoluted tubules and the distal convoluted tubules, so kidney. And then simple squamous, look how thin this is. We say it's perfect for the diffusion of oxygen and CO2 to go in and out. So the air sacs of the lungs, really important. Good place to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into connective tissue.